It was the winter of 1956, and the small mining town of Black Hollow, West Virginia, lay buried under a skin of frost. The air smelled of coal smoke, and the sky was a permanent grey haze from the mines that had been working day and night for decades. Mining wasn't just a job here, it was life, and it was death. Every man who descended into those tunnels knew he might not come back. Some didn't. On the morning of January the 12th, the shift bell rang before dawn. Dozens of men filed into the earth, lamps strapped to their helmets, boots crunching on frozen dirt. Among them was Thomas Hale, a 38-year-old miner with hands like stone and a reputation for being one of the hardest workers in Black Hollow. He had a wife, Margaret, and 2 young children waiting for him at home. That morning, he kissed them goodbye, told his son to take care of his mother, and walked out into the cold. No one knew it would be the last time. The mine was already uneasy that week. Strange vibrations had been rattling the walls, the kind that made even the seasoned foreman nervous. Men whispered about the sound, low, echoing booms that didn't match the usual shifting of rock. "The mountain's angry," one of them said, half joking, half serious. But in Black Hollow, you didn't have the luxury of superstition. You worked, or your family starved. Around noon, disaster struck. The ground trembled first, so violently that dust rained down from the ceiling of the shaft. Then came the sound, like a thunderclap underground, followed by a scream. A section of the mine wall gave way, rocks crashing down with unstoppable force. Lamps shattered, plunging men into sudden darkness. Panic erupted as miners scrambled for the ladders and emergency exits. The collapse was merciless, swallowing a group of men in an instant. When the dust cleared hours later, search crews went in. They dug through splintered beams, twisted rails and piles of shattered stone. Most of the trapped men were crushed beyond recognition. Among them, they found Thomas Hale. His body was broken, pale, and unmistakably lifeless. No pulse, no breath, no chance of survival. His fellow miners wept as they carried him out, covered with a tattered sheet. His death certificate was signed that very evening. Cause of death, trauma from collapse. The town mourned him deeply. Black Hollow was small, and every death echoed through the community like a hammer striking steel. For Margaret and the children, the world seemed to end that night. But there were details that no one spoke of, things whispered only in private. When his body was retrieved, some claimed Thomas's eyes were open, staring, almost as if he were watching the men who carried him. Others swore they heard faint scratching sounds, even after he had been declared dead. Still, nothing unusual was written on the report. The man was gone. He was buried in the Hollow Ridge Cemetery, beneath a heavy wooden coffin and 6 feet of cold, frozen soil. His wife stood at the grave in silence, unable to cry, unable to move as the last shovel of dirt fell. Everyone believed that was the end of Thomas Hale. But Black Hollow had not seen the last of him. The funeral of Thomas Hale was held 3 days after the collapse. Black Hollow was no stranger to funerals. Coal mining towns rarely were. But this one felt heavier, darker, as though the air itself resisted the gathering. Snow had fallen the night before, thick and silent, blanketing the cemetery in white. The ground was frozen stiff, and it took half the morning for gravediggers to break through the crust of earth. The townsfolk came in quiet groups, boots crunching against the ice, heads lowered against the biting wind. Every man in that crowd knew the risks of the mine, but Thomas's death had struck deeper than most. He was strong, dependable, the kind of miner who could carry another man on his back out of a collapsing shaft. If he could be taken, then no one was safe. His widow, Margaret Hale, stood at the edge of the open grave, her black veil trembling against the wind. Her eyes were hollow, emptied of tears. Beside her, their 2 children clung to her dress. Samuel, just 10 years old, and little Grace, only 6. The boy tried to be brave, his jaw clenched, but the girl sobbed openly, her cries cutting through the silence of the crowd. The coffin, plain wood with iron fittings, was carried on the shoulders of 4 miners who had once worked alongside Thomas. None of them could bring themselves to look at it for long. They whispered among themselves, Not loud enough for the widow to hear, but the words still hung in the air. "Did you see his eyes? Open, like he wasn't gone." "I swear I heard scratching when they pulled him out, like he was trying to—" "Shut it, he's dead. Best leave it at that." The priest began to speak, his voice carried by the cold wind, but the usual comfort of scripture felt thin, almost broken. He spoke of dust returning to dust, of eternal rest, of a man's labor rewarded in heaven. Yet even as the words fell, some in the crowd couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas's story was not finished. As the coffin was lowered into the earth, Margaret turned her face away. She couldn't bear to watch the final descent. The children clutched each other, and the boy whispered, "He's not really gone. I know he's not." No one paid attention. Children say strange things in grief. Shovels of frozen dirt struck the lid with a dull thud, one after another. Each sound echoed like a heartbeat, slowing, fading, until the coffin was covered. The mound of earth stood fresh against the snow. One by one, the mourners left, their boots leaving shallow tracks in the white ground. Margaret stayed behind until the cemetery was empty. She stood there for nearly an hour, staring at the grave, lips pressed tight as though she wanted to speak but couldn't. Some said they saw her mouth move, whispering into the wind, but no words came out. That night, Black Hollow slept uneasily. In homes lit by weak lanterns, people told stories of Thomas, his strength, his laughter, his endless devotion to his family. But in the silence between words, everyone felt it, a weight, an unfinished chord, a presence that hadn't yet left. The coffin was in the ground, yes, the prayers were spoken, the dirt was sealed. By all accounts, Thomas Hale was gone. But if death was meant to be the end, then why did so many swear they heard footsteps outside their windows that night? Heavy, dragging footsteps, moving toward the Hale house. It was 5 days after the funeral when the first whispers began. At first, they were just rumors, strange sightings, shapes seen at the edge of the road, noises outside windows in the dead of night. Black Hollow was a superstitious town, and grief often played tricks on the mind. But by the end of that week, too many people had seen the same thing for it to be dismissed as imagination. On the evening of January the 20th, 1956, a farmer named Elias Crowder was leading his mule cart down the old coal road, returning from town. The sky was starless, black as pitch, and the cold cut like knives. As Elias urged his mule forward, he saw a figure ahead, tall, broad-shouldered, moving slowly down the road. At first he thought it was another miner heading home, but as his lantern drew closer, his breath caught. The man's face was pale, unnaturally pale, and his clothes were the same torn and dirt-stained garments Thomas Hale had been buried in. His boots were covered in dried mud, his shirt collar frayed where stone had ripped it. Worst of all, his eyes. Open, unblinking, fixed straight ahead with a glassy emptiness that made Elias drop the lantern in fright. The mule refused to move, braying and rearing, as if sensing something it didn't want to cross. And when the figure turned, just slightly, Elias swore he recognized him. Thomas Hale, the same man he had helped bury with his own hands. Elias fled, abandoning the cart, running until his lungs burned. By the next morning, the entire town was buzzing with his story. Some laughed, others shook their heads, but the tale couldn't be silenced. And then, by nightfall, 2 more people came forward. A group of children swore they saw Thomas standing at the edge of the forest, watching them in silence before turning and walking into the trees. A widow living near the cemetery claimed she heard footsteps outside her door, slow and drag. Jing, and when she peeked out, there he was, standing in the snow, his skin as pale as the moonlight, staring directly at her house. The final confirmation came when Margaret Hale herself saw him. It was late. The children were asleep. The fire burned low. Margaret sat by the window, rocking in silence, too numb for tears. Then she saw movement in the road outside. At first she thought it was just another neighbor returning home, but when the man stepped into the pale wash of the moon, her heart froze. It was Thomas, her husband. His shoulders slumped, his face pale and expressionless, his eyes fixed on the house as if it were pulling him forward. Margaret screamed so loudly it woke the entire street. Neighbors rushed outside, some carrying lamps, others rifles, but when they reached her door, Thomas was already standing in the yard. The crowd gasped. This wasn't rumor anymore. They were all staring at the impossible, at a man they had buried with their own hands. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He only stared at them with lifeless eyes before stepping forward, boots crunching in the snow. Margaret fainted, collapsing on the floor. The children screamed. The men of the town, hardened miners who had faced death underground, felt their courage collapse in an instant. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, Thomas turned and walked into the shadows of the trees. His figure disappeared into the blackness, leaving the town trembling in silence. The next morning, his tracks were still there, leading from the cemetery to the Hale house. And the grave of Thomas Hale? When checked by frightened men later that day, it was exactly as it had been left. The dirt undisturbed, the coffin untouched. In the days following Thomas's first return, the Hale household became a place of whispered prayers and sleepless nights. Margaret, pale and trembling, refused to leave her home. The children clung to her skirts during the day and woke screaming from nightmares at night. Neighbors tried to reassure her, saying it must have been grief, a trick of the mind. But those who had stood in the snow that night, who had seen the pale figure with their own eyes, said nothing. They couldn't. It was as if Thomas had never truly left. At first it was only glimpses, his silhouette at the tree line, or the sound of slow, heavy footsteps in the yard. Then it grew closer. Margaret swore she heard the back door rattling some nights, as though someone were trying to force it open. On 2 occasions, she found the kitchen window wide open at dawn, though she knew she had locked it before bed. The children spoke of him too, quietly, as though afraid he might hear. "Papa was in my room," Grace whispered one morning, her small hands trembling as she clutched a rag doll. "He sat on the edge of my bed." Margaret's blood turned to ice. She demanded to know what Grace meant. "He didn't talk," the girl said. "He just stared at me. His face was dirty, and he smelled funny." Samuel, the older child, had his own story. He claimed he saw Thomas in the hallway, standing perfectly still, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Samuel shut his eyes in terror, and when he opened them again, the hallway was empty, but the wooden floorboards still creaked as though someone were walking away. Margaret could no longer dismiss these stories. She began locking every door, every window, every night, stacking furniture against the entryways. Still, she often woke to the sound of floorboards groaning or the cold sting of wind against her cheek, as though someone had opened the shutters beside her bed. The smell of earth began to cling to the house, damp, heavy, unmistakable, the odor of soil freshly dug. Even the neighbors noticed it when they came to check on her. They left quickly, refusing to stay after dark. One night, unable to bear the fear any longer, Margaret confided in the town's priest. She told him of her husband's return, of his silence, of the way the children described him. The priest's face grew pale, and after a long silence he muttered, "If he has come back, he is not the man you buried." He gave her a crucifix and a bottle of holy water. "Keep them near," he said, though his voice shook. But the crucifix did nothing. On the following night, Margaret woke to the sound of whispering, low, guttural, almost like the rumble of the mine itself. She rose, trembling, and found the children's bedroom door ajar. Inside, Samuel and Grace were awake, pressed into the corner of the bed, eyes wide in terror. And there, in the darkness, was Thomas. He sat in the rocking chair, the same one he had used when Grace was a baby, his frame slumped but his head lifted, staring at his children with those dead, unblinking eyes. His clothes were torn, his boots still caked with frozen dirt, his hands blackened as if burned. Margaret screamed, clutching the crucifix, but when she lunged forward, the chair was empty. Only the faint scent of soil remained, heavy and suffocating in the children's room. That night, Margaret packed a small bag for the children and slept with them in the parlor, too terrified to close her eyes. The town began to talk in hushed voices. Some pitied her. Others avoided her street altogether. But one thing was certain. Thomas Hale was not resting in his grave. And whatever had come back to Black Hollow, it wanted to be inside his home again. By February, Black Hollow was unraveling. Whispers about Thomas Hale were no longer confined to back porches and dim-lit taverns. They had become the pulse of the town. Mothers warned their children not to wander near the Hale house. Miners crossed themselves before descending into the shafts, muttering that the earth had already claimed one, and it might not stop there. For Margaret and the children, every day was a waking nightmare. Thomas no longer appeared only in fleeting glimpses. He lingered. Sometimes in the yard, sometimes just beyond the kitchen window, sometimes sitting silently in a chair as if waiting for supper to be served. He never spoke. He never ate. He never blinked. Then came the morning of February the 14th, 1956, the day Thomas died a second time. It was just after dawn when a group of miners walked to the pit yard, boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. The air smelled of sulfur and smoke. As they passed the tool shed, one of the men froze, pointing with a trembling hand. There, slumped against the wooden boards, was Thomas Hale. His body was rigid, pale as snow, eyes wide open but vacant. His hands were blackened, nails chipped and torn, as though he had clawed at something in desperation. His lips were cracked, and dirt clung to the corners of his mouth. The miners recoiled in horror. They had seen him walk the streets, they had seen him standing, breathing, moving. But now, in the icy morning light, he was unmistakably dead once more. The sheriff was called, though even he approached the body with hesitation. "It's him," he muttered, kneeling to examine the corpse. "Same clothes, same boots, same man we buried." The physician who had signed Thomas's first death certificate was summoned again. He pressed a stethoscope to the miner's chest, checked for breath, for pulse. Nothing. "He is gone," the doctor declared, though his voice shook. "Okay." "Gone again." The townsfolk gathered quickly. Some crossed themselves, whispering prayers. Others demanded the body be burned, insisting no grave could hold him. Margaret arrived soon after, clutching her children to her chest. When she saw the body of her husband, pale, stiff, lifeless once more, she collapsed into the mud, sobbing. But even in death, Thomas was terrifying. His expression was not peaceful, not restful. His jaw was clenched, his eyes wide, as if locked in some unseen struggle. One miner swore the corpse twitched as they lifted it. Another swore the lips parted, as if to speak, before snapping shut again. The priest, grim and pale, performed the rites a second time, but this time he spoke faster, louder, as though trying to drown out something unseen. "We commit this soul to the earth," he said, though his voice cracked on the word soul. They buried him deeper this time, nearly 10 feet down beneath heavy clay and stone. The grave diggers sealed the coffin with iron nails, muttering that no man should rise twice. Margaret begged them not to, sobbing that this time it would be final, that her husband deserved peace. But the look in her eyes betrayed her words. She was not convinced. None of them were. When the final shovelful of dirt fell, the priest placed a heavy iron cross at the head of the grave. "Stay," he whispered under his breath, though no one dared ask to whom he was speaking. That night, Black Hollow slept uneasily again. Dogs howled, windows rattled, and in more than one house, men swore they heard knocking underground, 3 slow, hollow thuds, echoing like fists against wood. By morning, rumors were already spreading. Some said Thomas had been seen again, standing near the mine, watching silently. Others swore the grave had shifted, the mound of earth no longer flat. One thing was certain. Death would not keep him. Not the first. Tea time, and not the second. The townsfolk thought it was over after the second burial. They had dug the grave deeper, sealed the coffin with iron nails, and blessed the earth with holy water. The priest had warned them not to disturb the ground again. "Let him rest," he had pleaded. "Whatever walks among us in his likeness is not Thomas Hale." For a brief moment, Black Hollow dared to breathe. Margaret tried to believe it was done. The children still slept huddled together, but their cries in the night grew softer. Neighbors began to visit again, leaving food at her door, whispering words of pity. The town prayed that the terror had ended. But Black Hollow had been fooled before. It was less than 2 weeks later when the sightings began again. The first came from a group of miners who were working the night shift. As dawn crept over the ridge, they swore they saw a man standing at the mouth of the shaft, his shoulders broad, his head tilted, his face pale as bone in the grey light. They called out, but the man didn't move. He only stood there, watching. When one of them walked closer, lantern raised, the figure stepped back into the shadows and vanished into the tunnels. By evening, word had spread. Thomas Hale was back. Soon, more accounts flooded in. A woman walking home late claimed she saw him in the cemetery, leaning against the iron cross that marked his grave. A young boy insisted Thomas was standing outside his window at night, tapping slowly on the glass with blackened fingernails. And then came the story that no one dared laugh off. On the night of March the 3rd, 1956, Margaret herself awoke to the sound of heavy boots pacing across her porch. At first, she told herself it was the wind or an animal. But then came the knock, 3 slow, deliberate thuds against the front door. Heart hammering, she crept to the window, clutching the crucifix the priest had given her. Through the lack, curtains, she saw him. Thomas Hale. Her husband. Her children's father. Standing in the pale wash of moonlight, his head tilted back slightly, his eyes wide and unblinking. His skin was ashen, lips cracked, veins dark beneath the surface. His clothes, once buried, were torn and stiff with soil. He didn't call her name. He didn't move closer. He only stood there, waiting. Margaret staggered backward, covering her mouth to stifle a scream. The children woke to the sound of her sobs and clung to her arms. She dared not open the door. She dared not breathe too loudly. After what felt like hours, the footsteps retreated into the night. But the terror didn't stop. Over the following nights, Thomas appeared again and again, sometimes at the edge of the woods, sometimes walking the streets long after curfew, sometimes standing in the very yard of the Hale house, always silent, always staring. The town grew restless. Men who once scoffed at superstition now nailed crucifixes above their doors and carried silver coins in their pockets. Dogs barked endlessly, howling at something unseen. Some families packed their belongings and fled Black Hollow entirely, abandoning their homes in the night. And still, Thomas came. One miner swore he passed Thomas on the road just before dawn. "He didn't look at me," the man whispered, pale with fear. "But when I turned back, he was gone. Just gone. By mid-March, no one doubted it anymore. They had buried him twice. They had prayed, nailed shut his coffin, covered it with stone and earth, but Thomas Hale had returned again. And this time, it felt as though he was not just wandering. He was waiting. By the middle of March, Black Hollow was no longer just a coal town. It was a place under siege by its own terror. The mere name Thomas Hale was whispered like a curse, and people avoided speaking it after dark. Doors were locked before sundown. Windows were boarded shut. The streets emptied as soon as the lamps were lit, leaving the town to silence and shadows. But silence could not drown the fear. Every night, more people swore they had seen him. At first, they were sightings from a distance, a pale figure standing in the fog, a shadow at the cemetery gates, or a pair of unblinking eyes watching from the tree line. But soon, the stories grew bolder. A butcher's wife swore she saw Thomas step into her shop after closing, trailing mud across the floor. When she screamed, he vanished between the aisles, leaving only the smell of damp earth and rotting wood behind. Children whispered of seeing him near the schoolhouse, walking slowly in circles, dragging his fingers across the walls. When the teacher investigated, she found deep gouges etched into the wood, long, crooked scratches that hadn't been there before. The fear became so thick it clung to every conversation. Men in the tavern spoke in hushed tones, mugs of beer left half-finished as they muttered about curses, restless spirits, and the wrath of the mine. Some claimed Thomas had made a bargain with the mountain itself, that the earth had swallowed him, only to spit him back out, unfinished. Superstition turned to paranoia. Neighbors began accusing each other of bringing evil upon the town. One woman was called a witch after claiming she heard Thomas whisper her name in the dead of night. A miner was beaten after admitting he had dreamed of Thomas standing at his bedside. Everyone looked over their shoulder, waiting for the pale figure to appear in their own doorway. And yet, the sightings only grew. The she's. Riff tried to keep order, but even he couldn't deny what people were seeing. He admitted in private that he too had seen Thomas, standing near the mine at dawn, his face pale and eyes empty, watching the workers as they gathered the courage to descend. The mine itself grew cursed in the eyes of the town. Many refused to go underground at all, leaving families without food. The company threatened to fire anyone who didn't work, but the men were terrified. They claimed they could hear something beneath the earth, steady knocks, echoing like hammer strikes from deep below. "It's him," one miner swore. "Thomas is still down there, working the mine that killed him." By now, even the priest had begun to falter. He preached about faith and light, but his hands shook when he lifted the Bible, and his eyes darted toward the cemetery, as if expecting Thomas to walk into the church at any moment. The weight of fear pressed so heavily on Black Hollow that people stopped speaking of hope altogether. They spoke instead of endings, of curses, of debts that could never be repaid. And in the center of it all, the Hale family remained trapped in their home, windows shut tight, curtains drawn, the children too afraid to sleep. Margaret lit candles in every room, but still she swore she heard Thomas's boots pacing on the porch at night. Black Hollow was breaking apart, faith crumbling, courage rotting, families tearing at each other in suspicion and despair. The town could not endure much longer. Something had to give, and soon it would. By the last week of March 1956, the town of Black Hollow was at its breaking point. Families whispered of leaving, but the roads out were frozen over and choked with snow. The men who still dared enter the mine returned white-faced, speaking of voices in the tunnels, of footsteps following them in the dark. And every night, the figure of Thomas Hale appeared again, sometimes near his own house, sometimes drifting through the fog-draped streets, always silent, always watching. It was then that the townsfolk reached a decision. If Thomas would not stay buried, then they would make sure he could never rise again. The gathering happened in the dead of night. Nearly 24 men arrived at the cemetery with lanterns, shovels, and shotguns. The priest was there too, reluctantly clutching a crucifix so tightly the wood splintered into his hand. Margaret had begged them not to do it, her voice breaking, her hands trembling, but they ignored her pleas. Some said it was for her own safety. Others muttered that she had already been touched by whatever cursed her husband. They went to the grave. The mound of earth where Thomas Hale had been laid for the second time was still heavy with snow. The men set down their lanterns and, without a word, began to dig. The sound of shovels striking the frozen ground echoed through the night. Their breath hung in clouds, mingling with the mist that rolled across the cemetery. Each strike into the soil felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself was resisting. After hours of digging, the first shovels struck wood, a hollow, splintering sound that made the men freeze in their tracks. Lantern light flickered across their faces, pale and wide-eyed. Slowly they brushed away the dirt until the coffin lid lay exposed, nailed tight, the wood warped from damp and cold. The priest muttered prayers under his breath. One of the miners raised a crowbar, prying at the coffin's edge. The nails screeched as they bent loose, the wood groaning as it split apart. And then, the lid was lifted. Inside lay Thomas Hale. But not as they had buried him. His body was twisted unnaturally, his hands bent backward as though they had clawed against the lid. His mouth hung open, soil packed between his teeth, and his eyes, those awful eyes, were wide and staring. His skin was no longer pale but grey, stretched taut over his skull. The stench that rolled out of the coffin sent men staggering back, gagging and cursing. Yet the worst was not his appearance. It was that his body was warm. One of the miners reached out, trembling, and touched his wrist. He's not cold," the man whispered. The priest cried out, raising his crucifix. "This is no man. This is a mockery of flesh." His voice shook, but his words carried. "We must put him back into the earth forever." The men argued. Some wanted to burn the body there and then, to cleanse the soil with fire. Others refused, claiming it would unleash something worse. Their voices rose in the cemetery, frantic, desperate, until a shout silenced them all. "Look!" Thomas Hale's chest moved, a slow, shallow rise, then a fall, as though the corpse was breathing. The men staggered back in horror. One dropped his lantern, sending fire spilling into the snow. The priest screamed for them to finish it, to drive a stake, to end what never should have returned. But before they could act, Thomas's eyes rolled toward the living, not blank, not lifeless. They moved. They saw. The silence that followed was so heavy, it crushed the air from their lungs. And then, Thomas Hale sat up. The moment Thomas Hale sat up in his coffin, Black Hollow's last thread of courage snapped. Men stumbled backward, lanterns swinging wildly, shadows stretching across the cemetery walls. The priest dropped his Bible into the snow, clutching the crucifix with both hands, whispering frantic prayers that seemed to falter in the freezing air. For a heartbeat, no one moved, frozen between fear and disbelief. And then Thomas opened his mouth. No words came. Only a low, guttural sound, like stone grinding against stone, poured from his throat. His jaw cracked as it stretched too wide, soil spilling out between his teeth. His breath, if it could be called that, reeked of damp earth and rot. The men screamed. One fired his shotgun, the blast ripping through the night. The shot struck Thomas square in the chest, but he did not fall. He only swayed, head tilting slightly, eyes locked on the living. Another man swung his shovel, striking his skull with a hollow crack. Thomas staggered, but when he turned his head back, the wound had already begun to close, veins knitting like dark roots beneath the skin. "Burn him!" someone cried. "For God's sake, burn him!" But the lanterns had been dropped in panic, flames sputtering out in the snow. The only light came from the pale moon and the trembling hands of those still clutching torches. Thomas rose to his feet. The way he moved was wrong, jerky, as though his body still remembered the stiffness of death. His limbs snapped straight, his back arched unnaturally. Yet with each step, his strength grew more certain. He reached the edge of the grave, staring down at the men who had disturbed him, and for the first time since his return, his lips moved. Cold. The word was faint, rasping, but it was enough to silence every man. It was a voice they knew, a voice they had heard in life, echoing in the tunnels of the mine. And then, louder, cold, dark. The priest screamed, "He is not Thomas! He is a demon wearing his face!" But it was too late. Thomas leapt from the grave with inhuman force, landing in the snow among the living. Panic erupted. Shovels and guns clattered to the ground as men fled into the night, their screams echoing through Black Hollow. Some tripped and were trampled in the chaos, others vanished into the mist, never to return. The priest stood his ground, raising his crucifix. Thomas turned to him, head cocking like a predator. For a moment, the thing wearing Thomas Hale's body seemed to hesitate, and then, with a sudden, violent motion, it seized the priest's arm. Bones snapped with a sickening crack. The crucifix fell into the snow. The priest's screams were cut short as Thomas bent close, his face brushing the priest's ear, whispering something no one else could hear. When the priest fell silent, his body collapsed lifelessly into the snow. By dawn, the cemetery was a ruin. Shovels scattered, the grave torn open, blood staining the snow. The men who survived swore they would never return, their eyes hollow, their words broken. And somewhere in Black Hollow, Thomas Hale walked again. Not a ghost, not a man, something worse, something that had clawed its way out of the earth, not once, but twice. And now, it was free. After that night in the cemetery, Black Hollow was never the same. The men who survived the confrontation with Thomas Hale were broken creatures. They returned to their homes pale, trembling, some unable to speak of what they had seen. Others refused to sleep, keeping lanterns burning through the night, muttering about eyes watching them from the woods. A few packed their belongings and fled the town before sunrise, abandoning families, jobs, and homes to escape the shadow that had taken root in Black Hollow. But leaving was not so simple. The snow-choked roads remained impassable, and those who tried to walk out swore the forest itself turned against them. One man claimed he walked for hours, only to find himself circling back to the cemetery. Another insisted he saw Thomas pacing just ahead of him on the trail, always out of reach, yet always watching. Terrified, they returned home, realizing there was no escape. Inside the town, fear spread like disease. Shops shuttered, schools closed. The mine, the only lifeline for Black Hollow, was abandoned after workers heard knocking deep in the shafts. knocks that echoed like a heartbeat, steady, deliberate. "He's still down there," one miner whispered, "digging, waiting." And then came the disappearances. First, a child vanished from her bed. The window was left wide open, the snow beneath it disturbed by a single set of heavy boot prints. Then a young man who had been part of the cemetery raid went missing. His wife swore she saw him walking into the fog, hand in hand with Thomas Hale, though no one believed her until his body was found days later, buried shallow in the woods, his face frozen in silent terror. One by one, families began to dwindle. Some fled in the dead of night, never to be heard from again. Others simply vanished, their houses left behind, tables still set for meals that were never eaten. Within weird chaos, the town had become a ghost of itself. Streets once filled with the clamor of miners and children now echoed only with the moan of the wind, and some swore the sound of boots pacing just beyond the lamplight. Margaret Hale remained the longest. She clung to the hope that whatever had returned was still her husband in some way, that Thomas's soul was trapped, pleading for release. But when she awoke one night to find him standing at the foot of her children's bed, his cracked lips parted in a grin too wide for any living man, she gathered the children and fled into the storm. No one ever saw them again. By the end of 1956, Black Hollow was abandoned. Homes stood empty, shops frozen in time, tools left scattered in the mine. The grave of Thomas Hale lay torn open, the coffin splintered, the body gone. And yet, travelers passing through the valley in the years that followed told unsettling stories. Some spoke of lantern lights flickering in the abandoned mine. Others swore they saw a man walking the snow-covered roads at night, his head tilted, his eyes unblinking, his clothes stiff with soil. Always silent, always watching. The government eventually struck Black Hollow from official maps. It became a place of whispers, a ghost town avoided by hunters and wanderers alike. And still, the stories persisted. The man who died twice. The miner who would not stay buried. The curse of Black Hollow. And some say even now, if you walk the old cemetery at night, you can hear the crunch of heavy boots in the snow, growing closer and closer until the sound is right behind you. Thomas Hale never truly left, and perhaps he never will.